Hello there, ladies and gentlemen, this is Orphan Last, aka Skylar Madison, and I'm going to go ahead and start this video off with doing some minor finishing touches with the line work, and then proceeding on where I left off last week by coloring this image. Pretty soon after I started to color, I wound up almost immediately jumping into working on coloring the grass, which is quickly becoming the bane of my freaking existence, simply because it's just so time-consuming. By the end of the video, I wind up working on the tree's leaves, and it took me absolutely forever as well. I'd classify that as being a separate bane of my existence, but a bane of my existence nonetheless. After coloring the nearest power line, I also went about touching up the line work a little bit, and then recoloring. If something seems a little bit imbalanced, you gotta fix your mistakes. Doesn't matter what stage you're on. And working digitally, it really makes it so that that's totally possible, especially if you're working with vectors, but you're not necessarily obligated to use vectors. I just like working with them. And as I continue coloring off into the distance, you'll notice that my line work isn't as detailed and crisp, and that's fine because the further and further away things are, the less and less details are visible. And when objects get further and further away, the saturation of colors also fade into a bit of gray or blue depending on what the lighting of the scene is. It's called atmospheric disturbance. With a character, for the color work, I wound up making one big colored object. Basically, one big object that's just the silhouette of the character. I don't think that was a smart idea because the masking capabilities of coloring an object inside of that big colored object, that big colored silhouette, becomes limited. Way more limited than if I just shaped every object to the shape of the character individually. However, I discovered that you can have an object that has no stroke and no fill, and have objects inside of it coloring that no stroke, no fill object, which is kind of cool. And there's no problems with trying to mask things out just as long as you have your stacking order in the right order. Then you're not going to be really running into any problems. And I think I'm going to use that technique again in the future, but not the first attempt at it where it had issues with the masking. So let me clarify. Having a colored silhouetted object is a bad idea. It's not very effective for masking. But having a non-stroke, non-filled silhouetted object is perfect for masking. Okay? After laying down all of my flat colors on my entire image, I started to try out working with light and shadow, and just like in my last video, I tried out making all of the perspective lines that I'd need in Affinity Photo, and I found it just as helpful as working with Affinity Designer. So I tried out the exact same thing inside of Krita with the same image. And yeah, the assistant tool was nice and all that, but I felt as if I was experimenting, and regardless of whether I was using the assistant tool or not, I was experimenting. And so I gave it a shot, and it didn't really work out as I hoped. When I slapped in the rough shadow blobs into Affinity Designer, I started to notice problems, so ultimately I wound up doing the rough layout for the shadows at probably about 4 separate times or something, start to finish. Just experimenting, getting a little bit of practice in there. By the time that I went back to working in Affinity Designer again, though, I was just so sick and tired of messing with all of these different pieces of software that I started from scratch again. And I feel like I've learned a bit more from doing the lighting this time around, but I'm not quite yet ready to provide a tutorial on the topic until I actually wind up rendering a result that's effective every single time. Because I also feel as though the left side of the ground plane and its vanishing point were all wrong. They weren't colliding into the light source vanishing point very correctly. So everything to the left of the ground plane vanishing point wound up kind of becoming guesswork, to be honest, and I wound up doing about 15% of the shadows by eye rather than with the vanishing points. I mean, don't get me wrong, I tried to use the vanishing points as much as humanly possible, but there were issues with every step of the way with anything to the left of that vanishing point. There wasn't much to the left of that vanishing point, but it was just enough to be a little irritating. I don't think it matters much, and it's fine. I mean, the image looks good. The way that I decided to do the shadows with vectors was easy to do as a concept when working with the layers panel. So I really don't regret the way that I laid out the shadows with the vector work, but it was more time consuming the way that I did it. I'd take an easier to visualize workflow that takes longer over a workflow that's fast, but impossible to visualize and impossible to fix if something needs fixing any day of the week. And once I finish with the flats and the shadows in relationship to the vectors, I start to do the minute shadows, highlights, the midtones sorts of coloring, the details, mainly on the bike and the character, not so much in the background. I do a little bit in the background, but yeah, it just wound up pretty much being done, it seemed like. I don't feel nearly as many details in terms of color need to be on the background because the background is getting further and further and further away from you, and thus losing more and more detail. Could I have added more lighting to the background or more colors to the background? Yeah, my main criticism of the color work that's on the background is that the roofs of all the buildings are all painted to look like the houses. By the time that I release this image on Patreon, though, I'll have that minor issue fixed, which can be fixed in probably 10 minutes, but probably a lot less than 10 minutes. I don't know. That's just a rough guess. Somewhere along the lines, I wound up working on the clouds, and really, you want a color that's kind of like the light source, but mostly white. And you just have that set to the stroke, and you draw these irregular lines in these weird little swoopy ways, and you blur every single line. You give each line a different blur treatment, and then you pull out a gray version of that same color, and that's a little bit darker because the bottom end of every cloud tends to look like it's going to rain, at least to some extent. And so, you know, you kind of swipe a little bit of that around here and there, and you just do it by eye. You make it look good. That's all I can really say about clouds. The first time I ever really painted or drew a cloud, to be honest, was when I started my YouTube channel, and I never had any difficulty with making a cloud. So I wouldn't really understand trying to provide a tutorial on how to make a cloud, to be honest. It's really easy. Maybe I'll do it, just simply because it's less obvious of a workflow than what some people may think. I think that a lot of people, they stumble with their artwork because they overcomplicate it in their brain. And a lot of people, they feel as though every single thing needs to be described in order for it to make sense to some people. But that's not the case. I mean, could you imagine if something like, say, morality or ethics was like that? Like, do you really feel as though every single thing that's moral, ethical, polite, impolite needs to be described to you in order for you to know what those things are for you and where you stand in relationship to them? It's pretty much the same thing with what looks good and what doesn't look good for you as an artist. It's the exact same way. But anyways, as a last step, as I was working on this image, I wound up working on the leaves of the tree, which was similar to the workflow that I use on coloring grass, whereas it was a little bit different because, you know, you look at a tree and it needs shadows and highlights, and those shadows and highlights are just as tedious as working on grass because they need to be just as elaborate as grass, the shadows and highlights for it. In the end, I wound up taking a ton of shortcuts while working on the leaves of this tree, and I feel as though the result was rather nice. The tree looks like a tree, which is awesome, and I'm very happy with how it turned out. I really am. But out of all of the objects inside of this image, that tree has more control points than anything else in the image combined. Like, if you combined all of the objects inside of this picture together, and if you were to, like, just count every single control point in the entire image, excluding all of the control points on the tree, and then you were to count all of the control points associated with the tree, there would be way more control points on that tree associated with the tree than the rest of the image. It's kind of obnoxious to think that, but it's definitely true. It definitely is. Kind of on a side note, last week I said that I was going to provide a video, at least one video, about Blender this week. I don't think that's possible. You know, I say things sometimes a little bit optimistic about what's going to happen next week, and, you know, if I have to work around somebody else's schedule, which I'm starting to do a lot more nowadays, you know, they have their own life, and sometimes, you know, they get sick or whatever, or they're just too busy. And so yeah, I don't know if there's going to be another video this week, but, you know, I do always try to provide you guys with another bonus video every week. That way you guys get 2 videos a week, and, you know, that's awesome. So I'd like to take a quick moment here to kind of talk about a little bit of an update with what's going on my Patreon. I got another patron. Thank you so much for supporting my channel and the content that I provide and such like that. Now, I have, once again, 3 tiers, if you guys are even remotely interested. The first tier is just being able to vote on what different ideas that you guys can come up with in terms of what should appear on my channel next, what I should be drawing next, that sort of thing. So you guys can somewhat determine some of the content of what's going to appear on my channel next. And then, you know, I don't have anyone inside of the interaction tier, but I think that the interaction tier is going to be pretty cool. It's an opportunity to get some really in-depth sort of critiques, as well as inside of a group, somewhat getting a little bit tutored to some extent, kind of like inside of a classroom with a screen share with a group and such like that. So here we get this little transition here, and we can see the final image, or at least the final image for this video. I don't know how I had such a huge oversight, but yeah, the roofs are the exact same color as the rest of the building. But other than that, I don't see much of a problem with this image. I think everything looks pretty dang solid, and I'm pretty happy with it. So if you guys are interested in this sort of content, or interested in participating with my Patreon, this is the sort of thing that I'm willing to output. Anyways, guys, that pretty much concludes it for this video. If you guys enjoyed it, please feel free to like, share, and subscribe. And if you guys would like to get more notifications from me, feel free to click on the bell or go ahead and follow me on Twitter. A link is supplied in the video description below. There's also a link to my Patreon if you'd like to support my channel. And if you'd like to see more of my content, feel free to click on anything that's appearing on the screen right now. Thank you very much for your time.